You are watching the press preview, a first look at what's on the front pages as they arrive. In the next half hour, we'll see what's making the headlines with Kate Andrews and Anna Soubry. So let's see what's on some of those front pages for you now. The Telegraph writes about how Afghan Special Forces personnel could become a new regiment and fight for Britain, similar to the Gurkhas. As the US withdrawal deadline looms, the Taliban says they will allow more departures. That's according to The Guardian. The Financial Times has the headline, US says drone strike foiled fresh attack on airlift as deadline nears. The Times quotes the Prime Minister saying Britain's terror threat is the worst in years. The Mirror reports on growing fears of surge in COVID infections as pupils return to school. The Daily Mail says latest figures show less than half of patients see their GP face-to-face in parts of the country. And we're joined tonight by Kate Andrews and Anna Soubry. Good evening to you both. Let's start, first of all, with the Telegraph and their front page. The headline there, Afghan commandos could fight for Britain like Gurkhas. The suggestion they could become a new regiment of the army. Anna.
Yeah, sounds like a very good idea. The Telegraph is reporting from a number of MPs who served with distinction in Afghanistan. Tom Tugendhat is there, Tobias Ellwood, Johnny Mercer, all of whom have had experience of these special forces trained by the British Army. And it seems that it's been given a good wide welcome, and it's difficult to see why it wouldn't be a good idea, because goodness me, we have let down the Afghan people. We know that there are still many thousands out in Afghanistan who shouldn't be there, and goodness knows how we're going to get them out. So this is the least that we can do to continue in some way to support the work that's already been done the last 20 years in Afghanistan.
And Kate, it does seem very much to be a new idea, not something that perhaps was in the pipeline previously.
Well, I think what's coming out from the front page of the Telegraph is that there were quite a few details that perhaps journalists had that they weren't able to report or weren't comfortable reporting yet until the operation of evacuating soldiers and civilians was over. And the front page is detailing to what extent these Afghan soldiers working with the British troops were putting themselves in the line of danger, going in, finding the interpreters, finding those who had the paperwork, going into Taliban-controlled areas and getting them out and getting them over to British paratroopers. So, I mean, you know, it's such a story of heroism and success on the front page of the Telegraph, perhaps details we wouldn't have wanted to report yet in case it put any individuals in jeopardy. So it's difficult to say how long this idea would be in the pipeline, but the idea that we would be reaching out to those Afghan soldiers now who are in the UK saying, if you want to be integrated, if you want your own regiment, you know, all options are open to you, as Anna says, it's just absolutely right. They've done us so much service already, and it's very important that we meet them where they're at and hopefully can recruit them into the army here too.
Yes, and a quote there that they've proved their loyalty 1,000 times. From the article, Anna, is it a dead cert that this will actually come to fruition?
I genuinely wouldn't know, but it does seem to have a lot of credibility to it, and it seems very likely. And if you've got good support coming from important backbenchers, the three I've just described, 2 former ministers, 2 chair of select committees, then you can see, and I think somebody, and do forgive me, there's somebody from the army who is also quoted, one of the senior officers in the army. So I think this is something that is obviously going to get serious consideration. I mean, I think the fact that it looks like these remarkable men have done great brave deeds, as Kate was saying, is not denied. I think the thing that is really coming across and is very striking and very concerning is there does seem to be a remarkable lack of a plan, and this has all been done very last minute. We've known for 18 months that the Americans were going to withdraw, and whilst nobody denies that the Taliban has taken over considerably quicker than anybody predicted, including themselves, nevertheless, it is striking that there seems to have been, and it is wrong, and it's the fault of this government. There hasn't been a proper plan to evacuate everybody that should have been evacuated and also make plans for the future of so many of these people. We still have no details, for example, of what Afghan refugees coming to our country, where they're going to live, what the actual arrangements for people to even begin to try to apply to be refugees to come over to the UK. There's no plan on any of this. It really is shocking.
Meanwhile, Kate, the FT looking at the continued terror threat and the fact that it is still a very volatile situation with fresh attacks being foiled.
Yes, and it's confirming that the US launched a drone strike to try to offset another terror attack on the Kabul airport. I saw ABC just moments ago was reporting that 6 people died, several of them children, from having to thwart that attack. But there was a car that reportedly was holding lots of bombs. It was thought to be another suicide bombing attempt, which was stopped by the US. But, this is raising a lot of questions. The US is still there. They're still pushing forward their evacuation efforts. There's still concerns that there could be yet another attack. They're dealing with ISIS-K, the regional group for ISIS there, which is extremely violent and pressing forward still with its attempts to squander the evacuation. And you have Jake Sullivan, the US National Security Advisor, who has said, I believe, quote, "The president does not intend to start a new war in Afghanistan, but there are now plans, and the president has pledged that he's going to go after those who set off that first bomb, and that there is probably going to be an increased use of drones." So the idea that the US is out of Afghanistan completely and for good simply isn't the case. It's going to be more of a matter of boots on the ground. And I don't think we're necessarily looking at the end of the US presence in Afghanistan, but a different kind of warfare, which obviously raises a lot more questions. Is this the end of the beginning of the evacuation and the retreat? And as Anna mentioned before, unfortunately for the Brits and for almost certainly for the Americans as well, there are going to be many people left behind who should have gotten out. What happens to those people?
Indeed. The Guardian looking at the fact that the Taliban saying that they'll allow more departures from the airport. It's a forced cooperation, isn't it, that the US are going to have with the Taliban in terms of the continued evacuation, Anna?
Yes, I mean, if it enables them to get some of the people out that they have to get out, there will still be people there that haven't been taken out of Afghanistan, including the people who supported the British armed forces, NGOs, and so on and so forth. And of course, we know that there are huge pressures on the border. I'm sorry, I wouldn't trust the Taliban further than I could throw them. So the idea, I find it quite incredible that the Americans are going to somehow stay and have a presence in Afghanistan by working with the Taliban. That's quite extraordinary. I mean, you only have to hear the reports already that are coming out of the atrocities that they have committed and the very real experiences of people who can't go back to university, the banks haven't opened and so on and so forth, the real fear that especially women and children have, female children have, that this is the end of their lives as they have known them and they just want to get out.
But what options do the US have if they don't cooperate in order to make these evacuations, to see them through?
Well, this is the difficulty. When Joe Biden set his deadline and decided not to waver from it, regardless of what was going on the ground, he put himself in a difficult situation where diplomacy essentially becomes the only answer because he has decided to evacuate. He has a deadline and there's no movement there. Now, both the US and the UK have hinted at this idea that diplomacy and international recognition of the Taliban will be conditional on their respect for human rights. But, that is a very broad statement. What are the red lines and are we willing to keep to them? As Anna pointed out already, we are seeing the Taliban go after comedians. We're seeing them killing folk singers. There have been some, terrifying reports of the treatment of women already. They're already banning them from certain roles. They're taking all female voices off the airwaves. That is not respecting human rights as any of us in this conversation would know it. So what are the UK and the US going to decide their red lines are? And when does diplomacy break down? I mean, these are difficult questions that we have to ask with many countries around the world, but this is a particularly important one because of obviously the US and the UK's legacy in Afghanistan now, and the fact that there was a lot of trust built up between the Afghan people and the US and the UK for the past 20 years, and it does seem like that trust has been thrown under a bus in recent weeks, given the fact that the condition started to deteriorate so quickly, and yet certain evacuation and the operations behind that evacuation, it doesn't seem like the US in particular made many changes to make the situation better.
Anna, just a short amount of time to have a look at the Mirror before we go to the break, and the fact that schools, when they go back, it's going to be a huge test as to, you know, what happens in terms of numbers of infections and spreading of coronavirus.
Yeah, we've seen a spike again in Scotland. And of course, the schools in Scotland went back 2 weeks ago. And so the schools that the Mirror's talking about here, of course, the schools in England and Wales, they're going back in the next couple of weeks. And it's absolutely right. This is going to be a big test. I do think it's important to say, though, that the real test is not the rate of how many people are getting COVID. It's actually how many people are going into hospital, and also long COVID, which is a very real problem. But it's the pressure on the NHS that is the test, if you like. But the Mirror's right to say that there is going to be a spike in infections.
GPs who see only half of their patients in person in certain parts of the country. I mean, I know quite a few people who actually prefer the fact that they can instantly have access to their GP and say it's quite efficient. But there's this article sort of suggesting it's not a good thing, Kate.
Well, look, the difficulty is nobody can really say what the exact percentage should be in person or over the phone or on Zoom. It should be patient-led. And, you know, we can't sit here and know exactly what that breakdown is going to be. The problem is that it's increasingly being reported that patients aren't very happy. And whilst there are lots of things that are way more efficient to do over Zoom, perhaps getting a repeat prescription, perhaps an issue you've already seen your GP about, you just want to follow up with. But for so many people, for their physical and mental health, which we'll come on to in the next story, it's really important to be having these appointments in person. So the fact that in a quarter of districts, it's less than half of patients who are being granted face-to-face appointments is going to be very grating to a lot of people who, let's not forget, last spring stayed at home when the NHS didn't have great messaging about still showing up to make sure you see your GP, for even routine appointments, to make sure we do that preventative healthcare. When at that time we really convinced people to stay away from hospitals, stay away from GPs, we have a lot of catching up to do. And the last thing I'd flag is that whilst a lot of people like that immediate access for their GP, even online, they're not getting it. The story says that some people are waiting 3 weeks for just a GP appointment alone. That doesn't feel like comprehensive healthcare.
And Anna, there are certain things, as Kate suggests, that you do actually need to physically see your GP for, aren't there?
Yes, there are. Look, I make no complaint about my GP surgery. I had cause to call them during the pandemic. Obviously, I'm not going to bore you with the details to why, but the service I received, which was via the nurse, and then antibiotics, you know, straight down to the pharmacy and so on and so forth, excellent. The problem is, as Kate's identified and the report in the Mail identifies, is that there's an awful lot of people in all sorts of different parts of the country who should be being able to go and see their GP, who aren't getting to see their GP. And it doesn't make sense because our hospitals are open, they are functioning, all the clinics are opening. You can go and see a consultant, and you can go into A&E or the other departments. And of course, they've got this huge backlog, which they're trying to deal with. But I think that the short thing is that actually we have a crisis that is developing very quickly in our GP practices. And in the meantime, they've got to open up because, if you like, the PR is not good. And there are a lot of people who believe you can't get to see your GP in any event.
And Kate, The Guardian suggesting that an estimated 8 million people in England with mental health problems can't get specialist help.
So getting access to mental health care was a really big problem on the NHS before COVID hit. And it was very difficult in many areas to be able to see a therapist or a psychiatrist if you needed that kind of care for your anxiety, depression, and other mental health illnesses. COVID has made the problem a lot worse, and it's also grown the number of people, very understandably, who want to get access to these services. Being locked up, being in lockdown for months on end is not a normal human condition, and a lot of people have suffered the mental consequences of that. It is yet another example of this huge backlog we have now in the NHS. It's estimated to be over 5 million on NHS England now, but the Health Secretary estimates it could go up to 13 million people. Those sound like big numbers, but I don't think we have acutely felt what that will actually mean if people aren't getting access to these kinds of key treatments. Yet another reminder that mental health should be taken as seriously as physical health, but that we were woeful on this before the pandemic hit. And now I think we're really going to start to feel the consequences of that.